Well, good morning. It's the morning of Thursday, 24th of May, 2018, and I'm back down in the southwest of England to prepare for tonight's broadcasts. And there is going to be an episode of Fracking Nightmare tonight. And obviously, I haven't been doing Fracking Nightmares recently, primarily due to the fact that I'm doing the 8:30 a.m. live streams. But tonight, there's so much occurring. I think it's appropriate to put out an episode. So that'll be broadcast on UK Column Live YouTube channel at 9 o'clock tonight. It will be preceded by an episode of Humanity vs. Insanity at 7:30. Well, I'm back here having travelled down the M4 and M5 following my visit to London. Every time I go to London, of course, I'm immediately reminded why all the reasons that I prefer to avoid the city as much as possible. But I was there to be present for Professor Peter Stiles's presentation in the committee rooms of the House of Lords, where he presented his paper regarding his concerns over the risks associated with seismic activity. And in fact, he's actually presenting that it's not really a risk, it's an absolute certainty that if fracking goes ahead in the north of England, particularly in the or above, below the old coal mining areas, which is pretty much the entire north of England, because the Bowland Shale, which is the target geology for the unconventional gas, sits beneath the extensively mined coal measures of the north of England. And so his observation is that based on his research, which is the synthesis of previous research on the geology of the north of England, plus, of course, his own input, his input shows that the seismic testing that is conducted by the unconventional gas industry is effectively a sort of not a waste of time, but it's just not powerful enough to identify the faults and the fissures created as a result of geological movement from the extensive mining. So his hypothesis is very interesting, or his projections are interesting, on the basis that he makes it very clear that he's not anti-unconventional gas exploitation. He's not necessarily pro-unregulated fracking, but, he believes that any industry should be applying the precautionary principle. And consequently, on the basis of his expertise, and of course he is a former advisor to David Cameron, and he makes the observation that he made very similar observations to David Cameron some 4 years ago. But of course, Cameron and Osborne just weren't listening. So he's making these observations yet again, but more forcibly, that if the unconventional gas industry goes ahead with its intent to frack across the north of England beneath the old coal mining measures, then seismic activity is pretty much a given. Well, of course, the other impact of this potential seismic activity is very much the contamination of the water supply. And yesterday, the Environment Agency, actually I think it may have even been on Tuesday, the Environment Agency issued a report. And here's what the BBC had to say in terms of reporting on that Environment Agency output. It says, England is facing water shortages by 2050 unless rapid action is taken to curb water use and wastage. And this is a direct warning from the Environment Agency. Now, in a similar article, there was a report, again put out by the BBC, on the list of global cities most likely to run out of water. And believe it or not, London is number 9 on that list. And London currently takes about 80% of its water from the Thames and the Lee Valley. Well, the irony here, of course, is that the Environment Agency, on one hand, is warning about the potential water shortages and expressing concern that every effort and care should be made to ensure that we minimize wastage and that we protect the water supplies that we have. And in the UK, we are totally dependent on the natural cycle. And, when I hear people say, oh, but, it's not a problem for Manchester because we don't get our water from the natural cycle, from underground aquifers. We get our water from the Lake District. Where do you think the water in the Lake District comes from? So the natural cycle of evaporation and, precipitation, and then the drainage and the filtration and, that natural cleansing of the rainwater that is undertaken by the soil. Now, unfortunately, due to, of course, massive agricultural contamination and industrial contamination, the natural process of water cleansing isn't sufficient. So we have to put it through further cleansing and filtration before it eventually finds its way into the mains water supply. But what if that natural supply not only dries up, but what is available is so heavily contaminated that our filtration systems can't actually handle it? And maybe to make matters worse, the contamination in the groundwater is such that no amount of chemicals can really rectify the contamination on the crops. So consequently, we're looking at a potential cycle here that is absolutely devastating to all life. And, if we look at what's occurring in Australia, now Australia is reliant in a big way on the Great Artesian Basin. The Great Artesian Basin sits below some 22% of the Australian landmass. And in southern Queensland alone, where the unconventional gas industry is just 12 years old, water is being abstracted from the Great Artesian Basin at a rate of somewhere between 6 and 8% greater per annum than it can actually naturally replenish, coupled with which the shallower aquifers are being pressurized by seepage from the coal seams from which the unconventional gas is being abstracted. So what's happening is that in southern Queensland, prime agricultural farmland is being rendered effectively useless. And this is an issue that we have covered on numerous occasions on episodes of Fracking Nightmare over the past nearly 5 years, and of course was addressed directly in the documentary that I produced following my visit to southern Queensland and to the gas fields in November of 2014. And that documentary, Voices from the Gas Fields, is perhaps arguably more relevant today than it was when I released it a little over 3 years ago in March of 2015, because it highlights exactly what Professor Stiles and the Environment Agency are now concerned about in terms of seismic activity and the impact on UK water supplies. So let me just read a statement that was actually issued by the Great Artesian Basin Protection Society back in 2010. And it says the prime consideration should be human health and sustainability of land, particularly prime farming areas and water resources. The precautionary principle should be paramount when there is potential for long-term contamination and damage to aquifers which impact on human health. And that was a statement put out in December of 2010. So we are constantly told on one hand that the UK has gold standard regulation, and of course there's no way that the British government would ever put the people at risk through sanctioning an industry that would lead to massive contamination, leading ultimately to massive negative impact on human health. Well, surely more and more people are now realizing that that is about as hollow a statement as we could possibly get from the British government. It is very clear that they are in fear of the corporations. Whether or not it's because the corporations just threaten to move offshore and remove their future tax revenues to another country, and so no, please don't do that. Please stay in this country. And what do you want in return? Oh, you want to contaminate the British water supplies? Well, it's not going to be our problem, is it? Because we'll just leave that for another generation. Well, it is my generation and the generation immediately prior and immediately following that really has to do a little bit of reflection and take a look at the enormous damage that it has brought about to the ecology and the enormous threat that it has effectively brought about for humanity in the space of barely, well, certainly less than a century. So maybe, just maybe, sufficient numbers of people will start to recognize and acknowledge their culpability for this through their apathy. Because the reason the corporations and the government are able to roll out these absurd agendas is because the people go, oh, it's okay, we're too busy. We got to watch the next episode of Coronation Street or Big Brother or X Factor or go to the next sports match, which is far more important than worrying about, what the corporations are doing to our ecology. Well, let's just take a look at the potential impact here. Because if this industry does get kicked off, it's not going to stop with just one well. The ultimate intention will be to literally have a network of fracked gas wells right across the whole of the north of England, indeed right across the whole of the Bowland Shale, which is about something close on 28% of the UK landmass. Every single well is going to require something in the region of 2 to 4 million gallons of water to frack it to achieve the levels of production, gas production, that the industry wants. Each well site is going to probably have something in the region of 8 wells. So that's something in the region of 30 million gallons of water per wellhead. That obviously generates waste. And that waste is so toxic that the government and the industry actually cannot explain how the waste will be dealt with. They simply lie and obfuscate because they know they can't answer the question. Just watch any interview with Lee Petts of Remsol and, it's prime blag. And let's not forget that when Quadrilla generated some 2 million gallons of waste back in 2011, it was treated by United Utilities, who quietly pumped the liquid waste into the Manchester Ship Canal without any third-party oversight. And the solids from that waste were so toxic, they didn't have a process that enabled them to treat them. And there has never been any explanation as to how the processes would now deal with that toxic waste. So the reality is that once the water is mixed with the frack chemicals, it is effectively lost to the system. And once it does get into the water table, it will contaminate that water table. And the flowback waste just can't be dealt with. And, let's not forget that just literally a few weeks ago, Claire Perry was asked a series of questions by Sarah Wollaston, the MP for Totnes and South Hams here in the southwest. And in response to her questions, Claire Perry made these observations. The government has not made an assessment of the amount of flowback waste which would be produced from any shale gas development. Now, for a government that has constantly stated that we have gold standard regulation in this country, don't you think that in 2018, 5.5 years nearly after the moratorium was lifted, the government would have detailed information on the amount of flowback waste that would be generated by this industry? But she goes on, it is the operator's responsibility to agree disposal methods of frack waste with the appropriate regulators as part of their planning application for all shale gas development. So here we go again. It's like, well, actually, you know, we haven't got any handle on how the flowback waste is going to be dealt with, but it's not our problem because we're going to pass the buck to the relevant agencies. And of course, they keep changing the relevant agencies. Also, there's the recent announcement that the Oil and Gas Authority is going to be merged with elements of the Environment Agency and the Health and Safety Executive to push through with this agenda. In other words, individuals will be very, very carefully selected who will be compliant in pushing through the industry desires to get these wells established without asking too many questions. So, you know, the people in this country should be very, very concerned. You know, the negative health impacts that we're seeing right across the world, wherever this industry has become established, are not insignificant. And that, coupled, you know, with the situation where in the UK, the health service is being deliberately destroyed by a government that wants to establish privatized healthcare, where basically, unless you're on a corporate payroll or able to afford the private healthcare insurance, basically, you know, just roll over and die because you're surplus to requirements. So it really is time for people to start looking at the bigger picture here. And as I've said before, call it a hunch, but it does seem that there are elements within the British government who would like to see this whole sorry issue of unconventional gas exploitation, fracking, go away. Because they know there's no votes in it. They know that as an increasing number of people start to realise the magnitude of the threat, then the opposition will become greater and greater. And the industry, of course, keeps shooting itself in the foot, with the likes of Jim Ratcliffe and INEOS suing the Scottish government, suing the National Trust, demanding public inquiries in South Yorkshire and in Derbyshire, establishing injunctions, preventing any public opposition beyond waving placards or standing on the sides of the street screaming. This is corporatocracy at its most absurd. This is the short-term gain, greed of a few people at the senior levels in these industries who simply don't care about the negative impact on the ecology because they've got a plan B in place to go off to some nice paradisical island where basically none of these problems will affect them. But they will affect a major chunk of the British people, and particularly those who have the misfortune to live in the sacrifice zones of the north of England, which is pretty much everything from Cheshire up into Lancashire and right across to the Yorkshire and Lincolnshire coastlines and down into the old coalfields of the East Midlands. So take a look at the information. It's all out there, and it is really now entirely up to us, because the government has said basically, look, we can't stop this. The pressure from the corporations is so great that we cannot stop this. It's up to the people of the UK now to step up to the plate, to create the momentum to shut this industry down once and for all, and give those people in the government who want to see the back of this the support they need to bring about that objective. And then we can get on with whatever comes next, which is most likely 5G. But nonetheless, you know, I will be certainly in court one way or another next Thursday to witness the quadrilla attempt to establish an injunction following on from INEOS and UCOG. So, you know, it should become very apparent that not only are these companies determined to destroy the ecology in return for the short-term gain, they're also determined to destroy the last vestiges of democracy and establish a raft of corporate-driven legislation which protects the greed of the few. How this pans out is entirely up to us. Okay, well, that's it from me today. So please, if you've got a bit of time to spare this evening, join me on Fracking Nightmare at 9 o'clock on the UK Column Live YouTube channel. And before that, at 7:30, I will be joined by Dr. Graham Downing, and we'll be discussing the 11.3% increase in deaths in the UK over the first 16 weeks of 2018 compared to the average over the same period during the last 5 years. So thanks for joining me today. If you don't catch with me tonight, I'll see you tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning. You take care now.